Star Trek III, despite some creative failings, was still a financial success. Another film, though, was uncertain. Remember, we are talking about the mid-'80s here, the age when profitable film franchises had yet to really come. This was the time when sequels were more about wringing some extra bucks out with a cheap derivative that frequently didn't bring back the talent that had made the first a success. Sure, there were works like James Bond, Star Wars, Dirty Harry, and Rocky, but these were far less common than films like Friday the 13th or Jaws that banked on being made on the cheap and trading on name value. And while the acclaim for Star Treks 2 and 3 were much greater than that of Star Trek 1, the fact was that each did indeed have a lower box office return. But these films have been much less expensive to make than Star Trek 1, which had been made for what it would cost to make one Wrath of Khan and two Search for Spocks combined. So it was seemed a worthwhile risk for Paramount to have Harve Bennett and Leonard Nimoy return to do a fourth film, with an extra $5 million over what had been budgeted for Star Trek III. Star Trek III had been locked in as far as premise went. It had to be about bringing Spock back, as that's what the end of Wrath of Khan had promised. And, as Nimoy was directing his first film, he was under constant scrutiny and on a tight leash. Success brought freedom. Nimoy was free to tell whatever story he liked, and he felt that, coming off of 3 heavy films, and 2 films that had a central villain, he wanted his real Trek film to be something that was far more fun, and without any real villain to it. But his film still had to address the consequences that the crew had to face for desertion and of stealing and destroying the Enterprise. At first glance, it doesn't seem terribly likely that those things go together, which is why you need to get some experienced creative people involved and really pore over your ideas, which is what they did, and produce what ranks as perhaps the most mainstream of all the Star Trek films. The failure of 3, insofar as I see it as a failing, was that the film had all of the elements but didn't make good use of them. In 4, they had none of the elements but made good use of what little they did have. For instance, the Klingon bird of prey was simply a way to escape the Genesis planet, nothing more, and they did not create it with any future Star Trek film in mind. Yet it serves perfectly the needs of this story, doesn't it? It's designed for a small crew. It can land. It allows for direct interaction with the alien environment of the past. Yet it has a cloaking device so that the locals won't see it. It's atmosphere capable, which means that we could do things with it that we never could with the Enterprise. We could hover over water. We could even be so low as to be in danger of crashing it. And the ship is disposable. It is such a perfect fit, you'd swear they made it in Star Trek III specifically to set up Star Trek IV. The final key was in bringing Nicholas Meyer back to help with the script. In addition to his famous work on the script for Wrath of Khan, Meyer had first come to Harve Bennett's attention because of his first film, which he also wrote, called Time After Time, which starred Malcolm McDowell and David Warner, and was a time travel story about H.G. Wells pursuing Jack the Ripper into the present day. So Meyer not only had familiarity now with working with Star Trek, but with the film's concept as well. As an added bonus, there was a lot of leftover material that he originally planned for the San Francisco elements of his movie that he could now repurpose for use in the Voyage home. So he would write the past scenes, and Harve Bennett would write the future ones. You'll recall that in Star Trek III, the film opened with the death of Spock to help get viewers up to speed on what the search for Spock was about. With this being the conclusion of a trilogy, it was felt that for some, Star Trek IV would need to do the same kind of thing, especially for the foreign markets. For that reason, some cuts of this film feature a 3.5-minute prologue by Kirk, explaining Spock's death, Genesis, and their efforts to restore their friend back to life. For those that don't have that cut, not to worry, the film quickly begins showing the self-destruction of the Enterprise from last film, used as evidence of Kirk killing a group of Klingons, and it shows the stolen data regarding the Genesis device that is being spun by the ambassador to imply that it was part of a secret plot by Kirk and his son to create both an ultimate weapon and a hidden planet to serve as a base to launch attacks on the Klingons. Sarah counters with the destruction of the Grissom and the murder of David Marcus, and the Federation president finishes this up by saying Kirk is charged with 9 violations of Starfleet regulations already. Like I said, this gets the audience up to speed, either by refreshing their memory over past events or establishing the state of things in order to understand why this film will be different from what we might expect from a Star Trek film.
Remember this well. There shall be no peace as long as Kirk lives.
Meanwhile, on Vulcan, the Klingon bird of prey has been repaired, and her crew has decided to return to Earth to face the music for what they did in the previous film. They've redesigned the bridge to be more compatible for them and adapted to Federation technology. The presence of a Federation database is going to be vital to solving the problem that they'll be facing. But this is an explanation for why it doesn't look the same as it did when it belonged to Krug. Spock will soon be joining them as soon as he finishes the tests that ensure he is fully recovered from his experience. His performance on recall, reasoning, and, naturally, logic are perfect. But the question, how do you feel, stumps him, showing that some degree of experience, some comfort with himself, you might say, is still absent. His rationale for going to Earth with the crew is not loyalty, but rather duty to the truth, ethical obligation rather than personal desire. The film had actually opened with a strange probe being detected by the Saratoga, and now when we return is to see that the signal is disrupting their systems, shutting down power, and it's not the only one. Even Klingon ships are being affected by this, and very soon Space Dock itself shuts down. Upon reaching the Earth, the oceans begin vaporizing and the weather is out of control. Eventually, the President is forced to send out a planetary distress call, warning everyone of the threat that is orbiting the Earth. Unaware of this, the bird of prey is ready to go, although not before Savik's cameo where she informs Kirk of the bravery of David's sacrifice. This is not necessary, and I don't say that as a criticism, but rather to illustrate Harv's approach. A mention of Kirk's dead son in Act 1 would normally be so that it would either inform the character's actions throughout the film, play into the theme of the film, have some relevance to a later event, or something else along those lines. But Harv's view of Star Trek was always an emphasis on the character, and thus this scene isn't presented for the sake of the narrative, but the sake of the humanity, if you'll pardon the expression when applied to an alien. The fact that she is telling him now leaves room for interpretation as to why she is saying it now. There was ample opportunity, after all, on the journey to Vulcan, or after the ceremony if it seemed like it wasn't the right time to discuss such a fresh event. Saying it now is the final opportunity to do it before she may never have the opportunity. Is it because Savick regrets heaping responsibility for all of the deaths on David's shoulders only for him to later on lay down his life in her place? Or is it simply because she has such respect for Kirk that she feels that he cannot go unless she has made clear just what David did for her in the end? We don't know, and it's fine that we don't know. Harv leaves it out there for us to interpret as we will. It's here to provide a coda to Savik's story, her way of exiting it by letting us know the final thing that she is saying is to discuss something that left an impression upon her. As they near Earth, they're confused by the lack of activity and the strange transmissions, but the President's message fills them in. A discussion among Spock, Kirk, and Bones leads them to do what presumably no one else has. Listen to how the signals would sound if one were underwater, where the signal is being directed. Spock correctly deduces that the signals are exactly like the song of humpback whales, the reason the ship has been dubbed the Whale Probe. The problem for them is that the humpbacks cannot respond because they have been hunted to extinction, and there is no other way to know how to respond to the language in a coherent way. While this will justifiably be attributed to humanity nearly suffering an apocalyptic event on their home planet due to short-sightedness, it should also be noted the irony of this situation. The whale probe clumsily flies through space with no thought of how its signal might affect the clearly artificial structures that it is passing. then proceeds to wreak such massive environmental damage that life on the entire planet is put in jeopardy. In other words, the whale probe is the embodiment of the very attitudes that led to the humpback's extinction in the first place: species-specific myopia and ignorance or apathy to environmental consequences of one's actions. Spock states that there is only one place to find humpbacks, and that's on the Earth of the past. The Enterprise has traveled through time before, so Spock will attempt to repeat the calculations needed to travel to the past and acquire humpbacks. It is rather amusing, though, once you realize that they will be traveling through time thanks to a vehicle that belongs to Christopher Lloyd. The voyage home will be noted for being light-hearted, but as Kirk relays the results of their investigation and their plan to Starfleet, Nimoy takes the opportunity to remind us that the situation is dire by showing how grim things are even in the headquarters of Starfleet Command. It's in a case of futile struggle here. They can't keep their monitors dry, or prevent the windows from blowing in from the winds, or even properly receive a transmission without heavy distortion. So this may involve time travel, whales, and fish out of water incidents, but this reminds us that the reasons for all of this are nevertheless deadly serious. So as the ship begins to give under the strain, the bird of prey achieves time warp, as Bones calls it, and a transition scene involving what is presumably Kirk's delusions, artfully done, of course, to drop them into the 1980s. They quickly cloak to avoid detection, but Scotty warns that the Klingon crystals were severely drained by the trip. They're going to break down and leave them powerless by tomorrow. So Spock devises a means of using nuclear fission to acquire photons to restore the crystals to their proper forms. This allows for them to split into 3 groups: one to search for the whales detected in San Francisco, one to build a tank for the whales in the bird of prey, and one to locate a nuclear vessel that can be quietly boarded for the high-energy photons that are needed. But Kirk lays out their difficulties, one of which being that the past is a strange culture to them, flirtations with many things we might not even fathom today. One example related to the movie's marketing, for instance, was this was a time when 900 numbers were in use at the time. It was a way to wring a few extra bucks out of people. And Star Trek IV, believe it or not, had a 900 number as well. It was written by Walter Koenig and voiced by Nichelle Nichols and DeForest Kelley.
This is Communications Officer Uhura, opening hailing frequencies for Dr. McCoy.
Time warp? Time warp? Are they crazy?
Sir, we've done it before. If you'll remember our encounter with Captain Christopher, and later with Gary Seven.
That was before Scotty's uniform had to be let out, Kirk needed reading glasses, and Chekhov lost his innocence. We were all a hell of a lot younger then.
Surely something is to be said for the wisdom that comes with experience.
Experience? Shakespeare said, I had rather a fool to make me happy than experience to make me sad. And something tells me if we do this time warp thing, we're all going to be very, very sad.
Thanks to the glasses Kirk received for his birthday in Star Trek II, they have the money to finance their excursion. Kirk and Spock looking for the whales, Uhura and Chekhov the naval base, and the rest the tank materials. Star Trek IV is generally considered to be the funny one, but I think what won audiences over isn't the fact that it's funny, because this is not wall-to-wall jokes like a comedy. Rather, I think it's the charm of it, and the charm lies in the beloved characters. The Wrath of Khan was a wonderful film, but it did leave Sulu and Uhura with almost nothing to do. The search for Spock had more room for the character of the two of them and for Scotty, so that they could have one personal moment. But with the voyage home's non-urgent menace thanks to time travel, there is plenty of room for this film to breathe, and thus to give the 4 supporting cast members room to have their own time to shine, at least a little bit. By this time, they were all pop culture icons, and the voyage home allows that fact to do the heavy lifting, to know that everyone in the audience at least knew who they were, and seeing them away from the bridge and the general carrying out of orders that was their normal job reminded the audience just why these people were special. It's thus why the image of Uhura and Chekhov will go down as one of the most memorable scenes in Star Trek history, the Russian openly asking, without bothering to hide his accent, where nuclear vessels can be found. Likewise, Spock fulfills a real-life fantasy of Nimoy, who had to deal with someone obnoxiously blaring a boombox without concern for anyone around him, and wished that he was in character to nerve pinch him out. We can understand the sentiment, since it is incredibly rude to go blaring your noise with no concern of how it might affect others. The punk here is actually Kirk Thatcher, associate producer, who co-wrote this song to get some real punk sound to it. He wound up reprising the character over 30 years later in Spider-Man Homecoming as an Easter egg, still lugging around his boombox. At the Cetacean Institute, the pair are led on a tour by Gillian, which juxtaposes the harmlessness of whales with the brutality of commercial whaling. This is to differentiate it from what's called aboriginal whaling, which is done for purely subsistence purposes and is done under international agreed-upon catch limits to balance the needs of the people and the recovery of the whale populations. At the time, Save the Whales was a common theme, and this was perceived as an urgent threat to address. It's arguably a success, since whales are doing much better now than they were 30-plus years ago, while the romanticism around whales and dolphins has significantly diminished. William Shatner did remark on the commentary track for the film that he thinks it might be possible that whales are more intelligent than humans, although I suppose it could be argued that no whale has ever directed Star Trek V. The two humpbacks made for the film by ILM, this was when the Genesis effect clip was one of the most cutting-edge computer special effects there ever was, so there was no way they were going to realize the whales with anything short of animatronics. So the whales now make their appearance. George and Gracie are confined in a large tank, but it is small in comparison to the open ocean, so Kirk sees this as a bit of good fortune. Beam the whales into the tank once they've completed it, and their mission will be a success. But Spock feels that to do so without first obtaining George and Gracie's permission would be unethical. A not unreasonable concern, although his decision to hop into the tank and mind meld in front of everyone would be argued to be less than reasonable. Gillian throws them out, but on her way back, seems unable to resist stopping when she sees the two of them walking up the road. As I said, the romanticism around cetaceans was quite high in the 80s, so harmless kooks are probably just a part of the job for her. And despite the disruption, they were harmless, even empathetic to the whale situation when you get down to it. I mean, you could say they were a little too empathetic, though, because during the ride home, Spock lets slip the secret that Gracie is pregnant. Part of the character journey between Kirk and Spock this film is that Spock still has not fully recovered from his experience. He has knowledge, but seems to lack the experiences that allow him to use that knowledge to full effect. He knows fully well how to get from the 23rd century to the 1980s, but not in the least how to behave in a way that won't attract attention or risk jeopardizing their mission here. The personal and the practical are likely the reasons that Kirk chose to bring Spock with him. Personal because he's concerned about Spock's well-being with his judgment compromised, and practical because with that judgment compromise, Spock might do something that endangers himself and or complicates their mission. Though one could argue the whole tank incident shows that he's already doing both. Of course, for the purpose of the film, it adds to the charm and the reputation for humor, as Shatner and Nimoy pull off a great double act. As for Scotty and McCoy, they're meeting with the head of Plexicorp on the pretense that Scotty is a professor of some renown in Scotland and has been invited here to examine their manufacturing techniques, while Sulu is speaking to the pilot of the helicopter outside. There was supposed to be more of a plot line for Sulu. Upon arriving, Sulu had commented that he was born in San Francisco, and this was supposed to be a relative of his. But there were problems with the child actor, so unfortunately this had to be abandoned. But the Scotty McCoy part makes up for any deficiencies as they betray their unfamiliarity with 20th century technology, even as they're trying to show Dr. Nichols this space-age new material called transparent aluminum. The closest we currently have is a specially baked aluminum oxynitride ceramic backed up by glass and polymers, just in case you were curious. Obviously, this is something light years beyond that. Not that you could tell by the expert inventor of it trying to program a computer by speaking into the mouse. While I may have made a small joke about Star Trek V: The Final Frontier, I nevertheless want to make use of it because I think we can draw a lesson from it in its applicability to Star Trek IV. Now, keep in mind as I do this, if I wanted to trash Star Trek V, I could make a video called Discussing Star Trek V and do exactly that. I am honestly bringing up because I think it is of help to us here. Okay, let's begin. First, going back to the Voyage home, we have to acknowledge that while it is the most successful Star Trek film of its time, it's also at the extreme end of the bell curve. It's pushed about as far as it can go without becoming self-parody or camp. The Voyage home works, but it works only because other films don't try to do the same thing. The failure of Star Trek V has absolutely nothing to do with it not being like Star Trek IV, because any film that tried to be like Star Trek IV is going to be as doomed to failure as those that have tried to emulate Wrath of Khan and failed. What we see in Star Trek V is Chekhov, Uhura, and Sulu turning against Kirk thanks to the antagonist. Now, this is nothing new. Star Trek II did show us Chekhov betraying Kirk, but Chekhov was mind-controlled at the time, and the audience went along with it. But what is implied by the film, and outright stated by Shatner outside of it, is that this is done by neither brainwashing nor mind control. The antagonist simply turns these characters against Kirk. The intention of the film was supposed to be one man stands alone, and that man is Kirk, but making the other characters betray him willfully betrays those characters themselves. We saw in Star Trek: The Search for Spock that these characters were so loyal to their captain and their shipmate that they were prepared without a thought to throw away their careers and follow him into possible death. That they would voluntarily choose to betray him simply doesn't fit in with their characters. Nimoy and Kelly had enough clout to draw a line in the sand and say, no, we're not going to do that. Our characters would never behave this way. Star Trek III makes this clear for us. If the ending for Star Trek II could be summed up in one word, it would be hope. But the ending for Star Trek III would be family. And that's what we see in Star Trek IV. This is a family. These people have come together to be more than shipmates. And they're handling this as a family. This is a team effort. The big difference that we're seeing between Star Trek IV and Star Trek V is that Star Trek IV is an ensemble piece. It's about the family. Star Trek V is about Kirk's character. He stands alone. As you can see, the audience is drawn more towards the film that's about the family than it is about Captain Kirk himself. He may be the most important character, but they still love everyone. The Voyage home benefits from this aspect. Its charm is drawn from the fact that Star Trek IV is a love letter to these characters that we care about. Kirk and Jillian head out to dinner to discuss the whale situation, and she is naturally very curious about what the story behind Kirk and Spock is. Even by San Francisco standards, they are pretty odd. It's not helped when Scotty calls in the middle of dinner to update on the nuclear vessel situation. Uhura and Chekhov located the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, and the pair are beaming in now to collect what they'll need to fix the engines. But their activity doesn't go completely unnoticed, and the lack of power plus the radiation interference leaves Chekhov stranded in the heart of an American warship. During his escape, he suffers serious head trauma, although the interrogator was probably thinking that he had already. Kirk's mood has soured greatly, first ranting at Spock, and then telling Scotty his estimate isn't good enough. It's not just Chekhov that's bothering him. At dinner, Jillian said the whales are being released since no humpback born into captivity has ever survived. But this, it seems, is whale hunting season, which puts them at risk, especially since they've lived their entire lives isolated from danger. but she won't go so far as to give Kirk the frequency of their transmitters to track the whales, severely reducing their odds of success. What changes Jillian's mind is not Kirk's story about being a time traveler who works in outer space, but rather learning that the whales are being released early, and she was not given a chance to say goodbye. Infuriated, she heads to the park to talk to Kirk and quickly discovers everything he said was true. But nothing can be done without Chekhov, and Uhura finally has word that he's going in for surgery with a low chance of success. McCoy naturally wants to do this properly, not the 20th century way, but the surprising thing is Spock agreeing, even though it would be risky actually locating him to beam him out. This is the first real sign we have that Spock is returning to his old self, because as Amanda noted to Spock at the beginning, the crew acted in contradiction to the logic of the needs of the many outweighing the needs of the few, to which he could only say that humans are illogical. To save Chekhov is to risk further personnel who might be instrumental in completing their mission. The needs of the one versus the needs of the many. But Spock recognizes it as not the logical thing to do, but rather the human thing to do, to defy that logic rather than to sacrifice a valued friend. The rescue, of course, gives McCoy the spotlight for a little while as he takes the opportunity to help people even as he laments the primitive state of 20th century medicine compared to his own time. After all, 3 centuries of medical advancement. It is less than a century and a half since the theory that disease is caused by bad air was finally put to rest. It is certainly unfair for McCoy to refer to 1980s physicians as if they were operating out of a hut using leeches or something. But still, it is a bit hard to seem that advanced when the most medically sound decision to be made at this time is to drill a hole in someone's head. After the rescue, Jillian invites herself along to help track down the whales, knowing the next stop will be the future, but they're going to need to hurry. Already, George and Gracie have been spotted by a whaling ship. Fortunately, the bird of prey is able to intervene and spare the whales, beam them aboard, and head back to the 23rd century. Ironically, the very signal the probe is emitting risks killing the only 2 humpback whales in this century, first causing the ship to crash into the bay and leaving them without power to beam the whales out. Kirk has to swim to find the manual release before they drown, but that leaves them free to finally respond. Translating this conversation with subtitles was considered but thankfully abandoned. After all, if the language was able to convey simple concepts, then the universal translator could have done the job. Leaving this untranslated emphasizes how different it is from our way of thinking, and it also removes us from the role of eavesdropper to a mere witness to something unknowable. The probe's departure puts an end to the threat, and power is restored to all the compromised facilities and stations. Now the crew can be rescued and brought in for court-martial, the reason that they had come to Earth in the first place. Spock makes the effort of joining them for this. Far from the act of obligation to the truth that this had started as, now he stands there in solidarity with those that he calls friends. Kirk pleads guilty to all the charges made against them, and the decision is made for all of the charges to be dismissed, with one exception, the one that Kirk disobeyed orders from his superior. For that, he is to be demoted to captain, placing him again in the big chair rather than flying a desk, a point that everyone sees as a boon rather than a punishment, and applauds in approval. After goodbyes between Kirk and Jillian, and Spock and his father, the crew heads off to see their new assignment, and while Kirk says a ship is a ship, it's not said with a lot of conviction. It almost borders on resignation. But the truth is revealed to us when behind the Excelsior they discover the Enterprise, NCC 1701A, and Kirk makes clear the real meaning of the title. While it could be implied that the voyage home means the trip back to Earth, or the voyage back from their time in the past, Kirk's line makes clear the real meaning when he says, "We've come home." Like Spock, what was lost to them has now finally been returned, and Kirk completes his journey of returning to the captain's chair of the Enterprise. And while the second film ended with hope and the third ended with family, The fourth film's ending can be summed up with the word home. Yes, the film is on the light side, and its science is even more dubious than usual, and its message is about as subtle as a punk on a bus with a boombox. But the redeeming quality of the film, what made it a success, is that it was willing to put those 7 people out there and say to the world without shame, damn it, we love these people. And the audience said, you're right, we do too. Seeing them return to the Enterprise is saying the long odyssey is over. We've come home. Look, your seat is right where you left it. Buckle in, because we're about to go where no one has gone before.
All hail